world says money is simple: earn, spend, save. But what if prosperity was never about money at all? Here, we uncover the contradictions that shape how we think, act, and feel about wealth. Welcome to the Prosperity Paradox podcast, where every story challenges what you believe about success. The strange thing about comfort is it feels safe while slowly killing your fire. This story begins when a man finally escaped the storm he'd spent half his life fighting. His name doesn't matter. It could be anyone, me, you, or the person you'll become one day. For years, he chased success like oxygen. He worked late, sacrificed sleep, endured the quiet humiliation of being almost there. He promised himself that when he finally made it, he'd rest, travel, breathe, live slowly. And one day, he did. The chaos stopped. The bills were paid. The fridge was full. The future for once felt predictable, but so did every day after. At first, comfort felt like victory. He moved into a nicer apartment, filled it with all the small luxuries he used to admire through shop windows: candles that smelled like forests, smooth leather, soft lights that dimmed at a whisper. He bought a new coffee machine, the kind that hissed like a quiet applause every morning. And yet as the days turned into weeks, he noticed something subtle, a silence that grew heavier, not lighter. He told himself he was just tired, but deep down he knew the truth. He missed the hunger. There's a peculiar addiction in struggle, not to pain itself, but to aliveness. When you're fighting for something, even small things matter. The sunrise feels like a promise, not decoration. Every dollar has a story, every risk a pulse. But when life gets too smooth, the meaning seeps away quietly, not in tragedy, but in comfort. He stopped setting alarms because there was nothing urgent to wake up for. He stopped learning because he already knew enough. He stopped reaching because the world stopped pushing back. What he didn't realize was that growth doesn't end when fear disappears. It ends when curiosity does. He had once been poor in money, but rich in motion. Now he was rich in comfort, but poor in spirit. Every comfort he bought became a small wall, insulating him from discomfort, yes, but also from life itself. He no longer risked embarrassment, failure, rejection. And without those things, he no longer risked transformation. There's a hidden truth about safety. When you live inside it too long, it becomes a cell. One evening, as he sat in the golden quiet of his apartment, he looked around and realized everything he'd once dreamed of was now furniture. The couch he once couldn't afford had molded to his shape. The view he used to adorn now blurred into the background. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt surprised by his own life. It wasn't that anything was wrong. It was that nothing was alive. That night, he opened his laptop and scrolled social media, news, distractions, searching not for entertainment, but for friction, something to wake him up, something to hurt a little, because deep down he was beginning to understand. When you remove all discomfort, you also remove the need to change. Comfort is seductive because it whispers, "You've earned this." And maybe you have, but it doesn't tell you what happens after. You start mistaking comfort for peace, convenience for meaning, stability for purpose. You stop asking hard questions because hard questions shake the walls of your safety. Slowly, quietly, you trade the wild uncertainty of becoming for the dull certainty of being. And the worst part? The world applauds you for it. They call it success, but success, if it makes you stop growing, is just a prettier form of failure. He began to remember the days when he used to walk instead of drive, when rain meant something, when his shoes got muddy, when time felt heavier. Now he lived in a world where everything was on demand. Even emotions could be bought: a movie for sadness, a song for nostalgia, a pill for anxiety. But no shortcut can replace the sacred friction of living, because growth is not born in comfort, it's born in discomfort, and friction in resistance. That's what he'd forgotten. That's what we all forget once comfort becomes our identity. One morning he tried something strange. He left his phone at home, walked without purpose, without headphones, without direction. At first it felt wrong, almost stupid. But somewhere between the noise of cars and the smell of rain, he felt it a tiny pulse, a memory of hunger. It wasn't much, but it was real. And in that small moment of discomfort, he realized something profound. He hadn't been living safely. He'd been slowly dying without noticing. The soft trap isn't made of failure. It's made of satisfaction. It's built from all the things that once meant freedom, the job, the house, the stability, until one day you realize you've become trapped in the very life you built to escape struggle. It's not a tragedy, it's quieter than that. It's a slow fading of fire, a gentle decline of desire. He escaped poverty only to fall into another, the poverty of purpose. And that's where our story truly begins. You've probably heard people say, I just want to get there. They're that invisible point in life where all the struggle makes sense, where the work pays off, the stress fades, and you finally arrive. But here's the cruel illusion. No one ever tells you what happens after you get there. The man from our story thought he'd arrived. Years of grinding had led him to this moment, his own home, savings in the bank, a job people respected. No alarms blaring in the morning, no more counting bills before grocery runs. He had reached what most people would call enough, and for a few months it felt like peace. Until peace began to feel like stillness, and stillness like emptiness. He once imagined success as the top of a mountain, the air thin, the view breathtaking, the world at his feet. But when he finally reached that metaphorical peak, something strange happened. The wind stopped. No applause, no angels singing, no cinematic music swelling, just silence and the long echo of his own thoughts. He looked down from that mental mountain and realized something: the climb had given him purpose. The summit only gave him perspective. The illusion of arrival is one of life's cruelest tricks. It promises relief that when you finally earn enough, love enough, or become enough, you'll feel complete. But completion is a myth, because the moment you stop reaching, something inside you starts collapsing. Humans aren't built for permanent satisfaction. We're built for movement, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. We're not meant to arrive, we're meant to evolve. In one of his quieter moments, he remembered a story his father once told him about fishermen in a small coastal village. The young men would sail out at dawn, hungry for the catch, braving storms and salt and sunburns. They'd come home with nets heavy and hearts alive. But the older men, the ones who'd already built houses and families, stopped going out as much. They said they'd earned the rest. And yet they were the ones who sat silently by the shore at dusk, staring at the horizon, restless, not because they missed the fish, but because they missed the fight. That's what the man began to feel. He had all the results, but none of the rhythm. All the trophies, but none of the tension. I used to wake up chasing the future. Now he woke up managing the present. And management, as he discovered, is a slow death for the soul. There's a quiet tragedy in the way society defines success as an endpoint, a final stop on the train of ambition. We spend years sprinting toward it, sacrificing sleep, relationships, even our health to make it. But once we do, we find there's no station, no arrival gate, no fanfare, just another platform, another view of the same tracks, and that's when it hits you. Success was never a destination, it was a direction. He began noticing how the people around him spoke about their lives. Uncomfortable. I can't complain. I'm grateful for what I have. All beautiful words on the surface. But beneath them, a quiet resignation. A coded way of saying, I've stopped trying, and I need that to sound noble. We disguise our surrender as serenity. We call it gratitude, but often it's just fatigue, a polite way to stop reaching for more. One night he dreamt he was running. Not toward anything, just running. Wind in his face, lungs burning, eyes watering. When he woke, his heart was pounding, but for a brief moment he felt alive. It wasn't joy, it was urgency, and that's when he realized something unsettling. What he missed most wasn't the success, it was the struggle that made success possible. A rival had turned him into a curator of his own comfort. Every decision was about maintaining, preserving, protecting, not expanding. But the human spirit doesn't thrive in preservation. It thrives in pursuit. The same instincts that once drove him to build a life were now rusting in disuse. He wasn't tired from doing too much. He was tired from doing too little that mattered. In moments of quiet, he started journaling again. Not the productivity kind, but questions, simple, haunting ones. When did I stop feeling curious? When did peace start to feel like paralysis? What am I protecting that's no longer worth keeping? He didn't have answers, but the questions alone began to stir something, because the mind, once it remembers hunger, can't unlearn it. A few days later, he went hiking for the first time in years. No phone, no music, just the sound of his own footsteps grinding against gravel. Halfway up, his legs ached, his breath shortened, and sweat blurred his vision. But somewhere in that exhaustion, he felt an almost childlike joy. I'm alive. It wasn't about the view, it never was. It was about the climb. We spend our lives chasing destinations, careers, relationships, wealth, hoping they'll save us from uncertainty. But certainty isn't salvation, it's sedation. To arrive is to begin dying slowly, because movement, not comfort, is what keeps us alive. The man stood at the top of that hill, wind roaring in his ears, heart beating like a drum. He didn't find peace there, he found pulse, and in that moment he understood. Arrival feels like victory until you realize the race was what kept you alive. The modern world is a soft bed, and most of us are asleep with our eyes open. Everywhere you look, life has been engineered for ease. You don't have to cook, just tap. Don't have to think, just scroll. Don't have to feel alone, just log in. We built a civilization that removes friction from everything, and in doing so, we've quietly erased the very conditions that make us feel alive. The man began to notice it all around him. The friend who once painted until sunrise now binged shows about people chasing dreams she'd long abandoned. The colleague who used to write songs on weekends now spent his evenings perfecting a digital cozy setup. Mood lights, ergonomic chair, comfort on demand. Everyone was optimizing their comfort, not their courage. And when he looked closer, he realized so was he. He lived in a world where discomfort had become an error, not a teacher. Feeling restless? Here's entertainment. Feeling lonely? Here's connection, simulated, bite-sized, algorithmically precise. Feeling uncertain? Here's advice, data, dashboards, distractions. Everything designed to smooth the edges to keep you from feeling the sharpness of life. Now, but when you dull every edge, you also dull your instincts. There's a word that rarely gets used anymore: boredom. Not the modern kind where you scroll through 5 apps in a minute and call it nothing to do. Real boredom, the quiet void that forces you to think, to imagine, to wonder. Boredom used to be a doorway. Now it's treated like a disease, because if you sit still long enough you might realize how empty all the noise actually is. One evening the man sat in a cafe surrounded by people staring at screens, faces lit by artificial glow, smiles half-formed. No one talked, everyone connected, but no one felt connected. He wondered, when did silence become awkward? When did solitude become punishment? We fear being alone with our thoughts because deep down we suspect they'll ask questions we don't want to answer. So we drown them in dopamine, quick, shallow hits that trick the brain into thinking it's satisfied. But satisfaction isn't joy, it's anesthesia. He started calling it the sedation of the modern mind. Not a conspiracy, not a grand plan, just a quiet, collective surrender. We gave up struggle for convenience, meaning for efficiency, depth for speed. We no longer live, we consume experiences, and the economy loves that because every moment you feel restless is a business opportunity. Every void in your soul can be filled with a product, a stream, a subscription. And the quieter your inner life becomes, the louder the world around you gets, just enough to keep you distracted from the emptiness inside. One day, he visited an old friend, an artist he hadn't seen in years. She used to paint wild, chaotic murals that covered her walls, her clothes, even her hands. Now her studio was spotless, minimalist. A MacBook sat on the table, a digital tablet beside it. "I make prints now," she said, smiling, almost apologetically. "They sell well online, it's easier." He nodded, pretending to admire her setup. But the room felt sterile, like creativity had been replaced with productivity. He asked her if she still painted for herself. She hesitated. "Not really. I don't have the energy anymore." But he could see it in her eyes. It wasn't energy she lacked. It was fire. Comfort doesn't just make you soft. It makes you forget who you were before you stopped trying. And modern life is a comfort factory, efficient, addictive, invisible. It doesn't punish you for staying safe. It rewards you. Likes, followers, convenience, validation. Everything feels good enough to keep you from asking if it's real. The most dangerous prisons are the ones we decorate ourselves. Sometimes he'd walk through the city at night, neon lights reflected in glass, people rushing nowhere. Every billboard whispered the same promise: be more comfortable, be more secure, be more in control. But the more control we gain over the world, the less control we seem to have over ourselves. We can summon any meal, any face, any feeling, yet we can't summon meaning. Because meaning isn't delivered, it's discovered, usually through struggle, uncertainty, and discomfort. One evening, he turned off everything, phone, TV, laptop, and sat in silence. At first, the quiet was unbearable. His mind itched for noise, for input, for the next small escape. But after a while, something else appeared, a whisper buried beneath the static. A question. When did I stop feeling wonder? It wasn't dramatic, it was honest. And in that fragile moment of stillness, he realized something most people never do. We've mistaken stimulation for aliveness. We've confused pleasure with purpose. The modern world doesn't kill your dreams, it just keeps you so entertained that you forget to chase them. He looked out the window, and saw people moving like sleepwalkers, awake but not alive, busy but not becoming. And for the first time he felt fear, not of poverty, not of failure, but of never feeling truly alive again. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Maybe the real poverty of our time isn't lack of money, but the absence of hunger." He closed it slowly, aware that this realization, though painful, was the beginning of something new. Because only when the sedation fades can awakening begin. There's a paradox no one likes to admit. Everything valuable in life, growth, love, mastery, freedom, is purchased with discomfort. But the modern mind has been taught to treat discomfort like a debt, not an investment. The man began to notice how every meaningful moment in his life had come with pain. His best ideas had been born from confusion. His deepest connections had come from heartbreak. His greatest transformations had started as fear. Discomfort wasn't the enemy, it was the hidden currency of evolution. But somewhere along the way we stopped paying with it. He remembered visiting his grandfather's farm as a child. There was a greenhouse, humid, controlled, perfect. Plants grew fast there, their leaves wide and soft. But one day a storm broke the roof. Wind and rain tore through the glass, snapping stems, scattering soil. Weeks later, when he returned, something unexpected had happened. The plants that survived outside the shelter had grown stronger, roots deeper, stalks thicker. The greenhouse ones, untouched by the wind, had withered under the first hint of cold. His grandfather told him, "If you protect something from all struggle, you also protect it from strength." That memory haunted him because he realized his life had become a greenhouse. Stable temperature, filtered air, predictable outcomes, but no storm, no wind, no reason to adapt. And like those delicate plants, he too had grown soft in the safety of control. There's an unseen economy that governs more than money. It governs the human spirit. Let's call it the economy of discomfort. In this economy, what you avoid becomes expensive. Every fear not faced compounds like debt. Every challenge postponed grows interest in regret. Meanwhile, those who embrace discomfort early, who invest in effort, risk and uncertainty, often end up with wealth of the rarest kind: resilience, clarity, confidence, peace. But these are not traded in dollars, they're earned in moments of unease. The man began testing this theory. He started with small things: cold showers, morning runs, awkward conversations he'd avoided for months. Each one was unpleasant. Each one made him feel alive. Discomfort became his new form of luxury, not because it was pleasurable, but because it was real. It reminded him he'd still had a pulse. And he began to notice something else: discomfort, when chosen, feels different from discomfort that's forced. The first expands you, the second crushes you. The difference is intention. In the world's oldest myths, the hero never finds treasure at home. He must venture into the dark forest, face dragons, confront the unknown. It's not just a metaphor, it's a map of the human psyche. We grow by going where we'd rather not. The cave we fear to enter holds the gold we're looking for. But in modern life, we've built systems to avoid the cave entirely. We want success without struggle, depth without doubt, fulfillment without fear. And we end up with imitation versions of all three. He thought about investors, how the biggest returns always come from the biggest risks. Then he realized the same law applies to the soul. Emotional wealth follows the same principle. As financial wealth, discomfort compounds. The more uncertainty you can bear, the greater the potential for expansion. But most people sell their discomfort too early, cashing out at the first sign of unease. They choose the predictable salary over the uncertain dream, the familiar relationship over the lonely search for truth, the safe opinion over the vulnerable expression. And in doing so, they become poor, not in money, but in possibility. He began to redefine wealth, not as comfort, but as capacity, the ability to endure, to adapt, to face the unknown without breaking. Because the more discomfort you can hold, the more life you can experience. When you shrink your pain, you shrink your world. One morning, he went rock climbing with a group of strangers. Halfway up the cliff, his arms trembled, his grip slipped, fear crawled up his spine. For a split second, he thought about quitting, about letting go and lowering himself back to the safety of the ground. But something primal rose up inside him, a voice that said, "Stay." He didn't conquer the wall that day, but he conquered something smaller, the instinct to retreat. That was the real climb. Later that evening, sitting in his car, hands still shaking, he smiled, not because it had been easy, but because it hadn't. He finally understood what no comfort had ever taught him. Pain, when faced willingly, refines you. It burns away illusions, excuses, ego, until only truth remains. We live in a culture that glorifies escape from boredom, from fear, from failure. But everything we're trying to escape is what actually builds us. Discomfort is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. It's the tax we pay for meaning, the toll for transformation, the proof that we're still alive. As he walked home that night, he whispered to himself, "Discomfort is not the enemy of wealth, it's the currency that buys it." And somewhere in that realization, something inside him shifted. The storm he'd spent his life avoiding wasn't outside, it was within. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding from it. Because in a world obsessed with comfort, pain had become priceless. There's a moment in every comfortable life when peace starts to feel like a prison. It doesn't happen suddenly. It arrives quietly one morning, one small sigh at a time. That's where the man now lived, in a world where everything worked, and yet somehow nothing mattered. He had food, safety, friends, health, no real crises, no chaos, and still, he woke each morning with a vague ache he couldn't name, like a note held too long, trembling at the edge of silence. People told him to be grateful. He was. But gratitude without purpose is like a fire with no air. It glows faintly, then fades. One Sunday morning, he stood in his kitchen, coffee steaming in his hand, staring at the quiet apartment around him. The same clean surfaces, the same soft hum of the fridge, the same carefully arranged comfort. He designed this life to feel safe, and it did. But it no longer felt alive. He thought back to the nights when he was broke, hustling, scared but somehow awake. The adrenaline, the hunger, the sense that every decision mattered. Now his days were measured in convenience, no pain, no pressure, no pulse. We think enough will give us peace. But if peace comes without purpose, it turns to numbness. Humans are strange creatures. We crave stability, but we're built for struggle. The same brain that releases dopamine when we win also releases it when we try. We are wired not just to survive, but to strive. When striving stops, something vital goes dark. He noticed it in small ways first. He stopped caring about what he ate, not out of depression, but indifference. He spent hours scrolling, half aware, half absent. He laughed. but never deeply. He slept, but never woke refreshed. It wasn't burnout, it was hollowing, the absence of meaning masquerading as calm. One night, over dinner, a friend asked him, "So, what's next for you?" He smiled politely. "I don't know. I guess I'm fine where I am." But the words felt wrong in his mouth, like a lie wrapped in politeness, because deep down, he did know. He just didn't want to face the truth. He'd built a life so stable that nothing could move him anymore. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. He thought about his younger self, reckless, hungry, sometimes foolish, but always alive. That version of him would have hated this, the predictable routines, the comfort he'd once dreamt about. He realized something painful. He hadn't stopped dreaming because he'd grown wiser. He'd stopped dreaming because it was safer not to want anything more. When you stop wanting, you stop risking. And when you stop risking, you stop living. In the silence of that night, another truth emerged. Maybe poverty doesn't end when you have enough. Maybe it begins there, because enough can quietly shrink over time. Not in numbers, but in meaning. When you stop growing, even abundance starts to decay. You become rich in comfort, but poor in wonder, surrounded by plenty, but starving for purpose. He began to see this pattern everywhere. The executive with a luxury car who confessed he missed the days of building his first business out of a garage. The artist who no longer painted because she feared the criticism that success had brought. The couple who had everything except conversation. Comfort had turned abundance into anesthesia. They weren't living lives, they were maintaining them. One evening, he met an old mentor for coffee, a man who'd seen him rise from nothing. After some small talk, the mentor leaned in and said, "You look good, but your eyes, they've gone quiet." He didn't know how to answer. The mentor smiled softly. "You've mastered survival, but you forgot how to struggle." That sentence hit like thunder. He'd spent years trying to escape the instability of his youth, never realizing that it was the struggle itself that gave his life texture and meaning. Days passed, then weeks. He began to feel a growing restlessness, not anxiety, but awakening. One morning, he drove out of the city and stopped at a trailhead he'd never been to. The air was cold, his lungs stung, his legs protested. But as he climbed, something stirred inside him, the familiar burn of effort, the taste of being alive. At the top, there was no revelation, no lightning, just wind and breath, and a quiet sense that maybe enough wasn't meant to be a destination. Maybe it was meant to be a checkpoint, a place to rest, not to live. He realized then that enough is a moving target. It changes as you grow. But if you stop growing, it begins to shrink, pulling you backward into a smaller, quieter version of yourself. The same life that once felt abundant can become suffocating if you no longer expand within it. That night, as he sat by his window, watching city lights flicker like dying stars, a thought crystallized. He used to chase freedom from struggle. Now he'd give anything just to feel the struggle again. And in that single thought was the essence of the paradox that comfort, left unchecked, doesn't preserve your happiness. It erases it slowly, gently, irreversibly, because when enough becomes too little, you don't need more money, you need more life. It began quietly, not with a plan, not with a grand decision, but with a whisper, a pull from somewhere deep inside him saying, "Wake up." For the first time in years, he didn't hit snooze, he didn't open his phone. He just sat in the silence of early morning, listening to his own breath. It felt foreign at first, this simple awareness of being alive. But beneath it was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hunger. Not the hunger for money or recognition, the hunger for aliveness. He didn't throw his life away or quit his job or sell everything to chase adventure. That's the fantasy people sell when they mistake chaos for change. He didn't need a new life. He needed to remember the one he already had. So he began small. He started walking to work instead of driving even when it rained. He cooked instead of ordering. He read books that confused him instead of ones that confirmed him. He said yes to things that scared him: public speaking, travel, vulnerability. Each small act was a rebellion against comfort. A way of reminding his nervous system that life isn't supposed to feel safe all the time. One evening, he sat on his balcony, watching the sun sink into the city skyline. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, and for once, he didn't wish to be anywhere else, because this feeling, this unfiltered presence, was what he'd been missing. He realized that somewhere along the way, he'd mistaken peace for the absence of struggle. But true peace wasn't the lack of movement. It was the ability to move through discomfort without losing yourself. He began to see discomfort not as punishment but as practice. Every workout that burned, every difficult conversation that made his chest tighten, every failure that bruised his ego, these were the weights that kept his soul strong. And just like a muscle, the soul atrophies when unused.
He used to think wealth meant having options. Now he saw it differently. True wealth was having capacity, the emotional strength to live fully, to fail publicly, to love deeply, to begin again. The return to fire didn't come as a dramatic awakening. It came as a gradual thaw, each small discomfort melting away a layer of numbness. He started noticing the world again, the roughness of tree bark, the sound of real laughter, the way strangers' eyes softened when he spoke honestly instead of politely. The more real life became, the less he needed it to be perfect. He was no longer chasing happiness. He was cultivating aliveness. One afternoon, while helping a friend move into a new apartment, they found an old photo of him in his 20s, standing outside a run-down apartment, eyes wild with ambition.
He looked at that version of himself and felt something close to gratitude, not nostalgia, but respect. Because that younger man had one thing he'd almost lost: fire. The fire to try, to fail, to be uncomfortable for something that mattered. We grow up believing comfort is the reward for hard work. But maybe comfort was never meant to be the goal, only a resting point between storms, because without friction, the spirit forgets how to spark. Without uncertainty, the mind forgets how to dream. Without discomfort, the heart forgets what it means to care deeply. The man had once run from discomfort as if it were the enemy. Now he saw it for what it was, the teacher he'd been avoiding all along. He began journaling again, but this time not to plan or measure progress, just to notice. He wrote things like, "Felt fear today, didn't run. Had a difficult talk with my brother. It hurt, but it mattered. Skipped the elevator, laughed at myself halfway up." Each line was a small victory, a reminder that life's richest moments often hide inside small doses of discomfort. Months passed. His friends noticed something different, a spark in his eyes, a steadiness in his voice. He hadn't made more money, he hadn't moved cities, but something about him had changed. He was present. He wasn't chasing comfort anymore. He was chasing truth. And truth, he'd learned, often burns before it warms. One evening, sitting by a campfire with a few close friends, he found the words to describe it. Maybe wealth isn't about having more or doing less. Maybe it's about feeling alive enough to care again. His friends fell silent. The fire cracked, the wind shifted, and for a moment, the world felt beautifully raw, imperfect, uncertain, but real. When he returned home that night, he looked around his apartment, the same space that had once felt sterile and suffocating. It still looked the same, but it didn't feel the same, because he wasn't the same. Comfort was no longer his master. It was his companion, a place to rest, not a place to hide. He finally understood the paradox. The goal was never to live without discomfort, but to live deeply enough that discomfort meant something. And as he drifted to sleep, a final thought echoed through him, soft but certain. True wealth is not what spares you from struggle, it's what gives your struggle meaning. A pause, a breath, a quiet smile. Then the closing whisper that tied it all together. Maybe wealth was never about money at all, but about how alive you dare to be